All right, all set. All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. It's always a pleasure to see familiar faces. I came up from Florida last night, and I got a reminder that it was the 30-year anniversary of the blizzard of '96, and so I'm much happier to be flying into this weather compared to what I remember as a child in '96. So thank you all for having us here today. This panel is going to be about guardrails and growth, building a compliant, high-performance culture without slowing down. And my panelists today that I have on is Becky Carlson, head of RCM at Joyful Health, Sariah Hopkins, CEO of Atlantic Health Strategies, and Michael Brunk, CEO at Pathfinder Recovery. So this is a closed room, and the assumption today here is that everyone already believes and knows and instills compliance, quality care, and ethical growth in their companies. But we're going to talk about what's more interesting and useful about when these things quietly break down in real organizations and what the systems and how they operate and need to be fixed in order to instill the growth and maintain the compliance. The focus today isn't a theory, it's what actually works with what fails later and what guardrails separate scalable organizations from those that stall, unwind, or get exposed. So we're going to start first with where compliance quality quietly breaks first. And so I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, in your experience as a CEO, what is the first area where compliance starts slipping when an organization is was growing quickly, not because people are reckless, but because leadership bandwidth gets stretched?
There we go. Okay, all right. Testing. A really great and totally valid question. I think it's not an easy answer to it. Pathfinder Recovery is the organization that I started roughly a year ago. We're a fully virtual healthcare organization offering support to folks struggling from substance use. And in a sort of a virtual space, compliance is a tricky thing. Frankly, I had the opportunity to learn what not to do from the organization that I was with prior to this, that was a startup. They were a brick and mortar, small, out of network, all the right intentions, great guys, but just really did not know anything about the space. Put a lot of money into developing this really beautiful building and all really comfortable beds, and had this idea of what great quality care meant. But when it really came time to delivering that care and doing it in a structured and safe and organized way, they really frankly didn't know what they were doing. And ultimately what ended up happening was roughly 3 to 4 months later, we got shut down for what ended up being a really small blip that we recovered from. And ultimately they're still I'm happy to report they're doing well now. But a lot of that was just faced with the challenges that I think behavioral health organizations have of managing growth. There's so much complexity, even just in a single state, single facility, that we have to think about. We're always constantly under the pressure of needing to get those clients in so that we can start billing, so that we can start to receive, money coming in, and how to do that in a way that doesn't compromise the company or the organization. It takes the willingness to admit that there's things you just don't know. So what I learned and what I took away from my experience at my previous organization was find the right people, find an organization, find thought leaders, professionals in that space of compliance that know what they're doing, and let them do the job. And that's exactly what we did at Pathfinder Recovery. We found a consulting agency. I knew that was something that I wanted to find. Not all consultants are built equal, so I think probably most people understand that. But through proper vetting and just really, finding the right individuals, they can really help to set those guardrails. I think it's a combination. The challenge is setting expectation. This is not a rapid growth. What does rapid growth mean in this space? I mean, I think we would like it to mean a lot of things, but a lot of times we are held like sort of hostage to the steps that we need to take to be compliant, to get insurance, to set up proper billing, supports and mechanisms to make sure that we're doing all the right things today that may be a little slower, may cause a little more pain, but long term, ultimately give you the sort of the peace of mind of knowing that when somebody does come and look under your hood, you're going to be okay. And that's really been the goal of Pathfinder, and I think we've accomplished that.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, we actually started up and sort of growing through M&A and de novo a virtual tele-platform right before COVID started. And that was probably the craziest time to try virtual and then also try to have the organization and then the state, the payers, the federal government try to figure out the regulation before telehealth was even like a real thing that is now today, the animal that is today. And so compliance was always crucial for us, but a lot of times, as you were mentioning, in unknown areas, especially in this space, you kind of have to learn as you go, especially if the path isn't written yet or you're carving a new one. And so I definitely understand that. But one of the other follow-ups I want to ask you is, and all the panels that I moderate, I like to speak transparently to our group because they're looking for insights that they won't usually hear from press releases or public comments, so getting more deep insight. But what are some, and not necessarily relevant to your exact company now, but maybe in your past travels, what are some warning signs executives usually rationalize away instead of addressing early right on?
I think the rationalization generally comes from, can I afford to pay payroll? And can I afford to, do all the things that I need to do to support growth? And I think when you're put in those sort of really stressful environments and distress, you have to make these decisions, it's easy to say, okay, well, this thing we can just pretend like doesn't really exist. I think about it like this. So I live just where I live on this stretch of road, and the speed limit is 45 miles an hour. But I find myself doing 65. And I've done 65, I've lived there for 7 years, I've done 65 miles an hour down this stretch of road for the past 6 years, and then I got a ticket 6 months ago. But because I was doing 65 miles an hour down the road for the past 4 years and nothing happened, I thought it was okay. So I think a lot of times we find ourselves in a very similar situation in this industry where I can get away with it today, nobody's really looking, so I'm gonna just keep doing it until somebody's there and they're looking and they clock you. And then what are the ramifications, what are the repercussions? So I think it's really just responsible sort of understanding about the space that you're entering, not setting unrealistic growth targets, not putting your staff in a situation where you're putting undue pressure on them to achieve goals that aren't really truly realistic, where they're going to compromise and take shortcuts. So, it's being strategic, it's being responsible, and it's also, like, again, the biggest thing I would say is if you don't know, acknowledge the fact you don't know and find somebody that does know.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I completely agree. The light will always shine in this space. Maybe not sooner, but it might be later sometimes, but it'll eventually come to light. And so, this is a great segue to a question I have for Becky. So, Becky, from the revenue cycle side of things, when you're dealing with new clients or even early stage clients, what's the earliest compliance-related issue that you see that don't trigger alarms immediately, but almost always show up later on as payer scrutiny, denials, or audit risk?
Yeah, I think one thing that people will be surprised by with this is sometimes payments for things that are not compliant. So just because it's paid does not mean that it's right and does not mean that you get to keep that money. So that's one thing that a lot of folks will use as a litmus test when they're navigating, can we get away with this? Can we do this? Can we bill incident 2 and not have this provider check in with supervision? Can we bill this CPT code that's maybe not on our fee schedule and we're hoping we get a good rate for, and then they get a payment and they view that as validation and they haven't confirmed whether or not that's actually compliant with their insurance contract. And then 6 months later, they're under audit and all that money is being clawed back and it's not accounted for in their forecast, and it becomes a really big problem, which also sucks because, why can payment not be a positive signal? And so it's really important, as mentioned earlier, of bringing in the folks that know what the compliance aspects are and will hold true to them. I cannot tell you the amount of folks in the startup space, in early businesses that I've worked with, where they're like, oh, well, so-and-so bills for this CPT code and they get this rate. We're going to do that too, and we're going to do it with a non-licensed provider. I'm like, okay, well, if your friends jump off a bridge, are you going to follow them? So it's definitely something that being mindful and sticking really aggressively to the rules and staying with them, even in instances where getting around them results in payment, because they almost always come back for that cash.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's always great to hear getting reinstilled that just because you got paid, the money is not necessarily yours. Now or later, that could definitely be given back. We're going to segue over to another segment called Financial Reality Check. And so, Becky, kind of segueing off of our last conversation, what compliance shortcuts look harmless from an operational standpoint, but create real downstream risk in billing, payer relationships, or cash flow 6 to 12 months later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that people don't realize is that your relationship with a payer is a relationship. And so all of those things, when we look at non-payer relationships that are like microaggressions, someone showed up late or they didn't do this thing, so you start to lose that trust, that happens with payers as well. And so it's something that if you're submitting claims that are not clean, they're constantly getting rejected by the payer and can't enter adjudication. If you have a large volume of denials with a payer, that's not just a data point. They don't forget that. And so when you come back for things like renegotiation, when they start to look at doing spot audits within providers, guess who they're coming to talk to? And it's one of those pieces where it very much can harm your ability to continue to work with that payer. It can very much put you at risk for entering audit. So those types of things, it's those microaggressions that feel like they're okay of, oh, well, we know these are going to deny, but let's just send them anyway, get them out the door. Well, those denials do count against you. You want to make sure that you're submitting things cleanly to the payers when you're doing that. Or, oh, we're going to try this funky thing and we'll see how it goes. And they keep track of those pieces. And it comes back to you from a renegotiation standpoint.
And what do you think is most commonly, or some of the top examples you see of organizations underestimating the risk because revenue still looks fine in the short term?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks specifically in the behavioral health space that love incident to billing, but do not do it compliantly. So for folks that aren't familiar with incident to billing, what that looks like is where you may have a lower level provider, like a nurse practitioner, who is providing services, but you bill under your MD to get the better rate. I imagine that sounds familiar with other folks. We always love those nice, pretty MD rates. And what happens is when they don't meet all of the documentation requirements for incident to, so the indication of supervision that occurred, the presence of that higher level MD in the treatment itself, when the insurance company does the audit of the claim, they request the note, they do a post-payment review, and they see that that billing provider is nowhere in the documentation, guess who's getting that money back? The payer. And it hurts every single time.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Yeah, we actually just saw that in a transaction recently where great outpatient psych practice and the revenue was artificially inflated because everything was billed to incident to and the actual work was being done by the NPs. And so while necessarily it wasn't a billing clawback per se, the detriment to the overall valuation was still present because you would need to continue to bill that way moving forward, and a lot of the buyers didn't see that as the right way to compliantly bill that service. Switching over to Sariah, Sariah has a great background in compliance and consultancy, and so Sariah, I would like to hear your opinion on where do organizations misunderstand the difference between regulatory compliance and cultural compliance, especially during those years of very rapid growth where things need to move very quickly?
So I have to give thanks to Becky. She set this up for me beautifully. When we talk about regulatory compliance, most of the time we're talking about what's in paper, your policies and procedures, your plan documents, are you accredited? Cultural compliance, people generally think, are we hiring good people? And most of the time you want to say yes and yes, but there's a big disconnect between those two. You can have everything beautiful on paper and you can hire great people and you can have a completely non-compliant organization. And they really interplay differently. The policies and procedures need to sit there to say, if we have an investigation, are we defensible? Can we defend ourselves against this? Your cultural compliance is, do we have a framework in place where we'll never have to defend ourselves because people know they can speak up and they can say something's going wrong ahead of time? I love real-world examples of this, and so I'll talk about an actual client scenario without disclosing who, what, when, or why, but we were called in on a False Claims Act situation to help navigate it. The issue had already taken place before this client became ours, and The question was, what went wrong and why, and how can we mitigate the damage? So we start with looking at the regulatory compliance piece. Does the organization have good policies and procedures? They did. Everything on paper looked great. They were CARF accredited. They were doing things correctly on paper. We start looking at the cultural compliance, and what we see is this is a really tight-knit team. Everyone knows each other. Everyone gets along. They actually knew each other maybe a little too well. The team was all friends and family. They hired people out of their religious community. They hired people that needed a hand up, especially in the administrative roles, which included RCM and billing. As we dug in deeper, we realized the people doing billing didn't have a clue what Incident 2 even meant. They didn't understand comorbidities. They were billing things that required like 5 comorbidity complexities when it was just a simple substance use E&M. They were billing things for overstating times, overlapping times, and it was just a big mess. Certainly didn't understand modifiers. None of it was done intentionally. Everything was being done very mission-driven, very best at heart, but the people that were doing it just didn't know because they weren't hiring qualified individuals. As we dug a little bit deeper, and this is where things get a little bit more tricky in this scenario, we did find there were a few people that understood that things weren't being done right. They knew all along that billing was being overstated. They knew this clawback risk was there, and they never spoke up. And they didn't speak up because speaking up meant calling out the COO's little brother or calling out the CEO's cousin, and they didn't feel comfortable with that, right? So that's where the culture of compliance and the regulatory aspect of compliance really go together. I'm not saying you can't hire a family member or you can't hire a friend, but if you hire those people, you need to make sure that your culture still speaks, that compliance really is king and you need to do things correctly, right? The culture sets the voice of what compliance actually means.
Thank you so much. And in your response, I just got to thinking, and this follow-up question is more for my own personal curiosity because I encountered this recently and I didn't have a really good answer for the client. We'll see oftentimes, not necessarily acknowledged to regulatory bodies, that organizations will keep multiple sets of policy and procedures. You'll have a state PMP, you'll have a Joint Commissioner CARF PMP, and maybe you'll have an unofficial PMP of how things really work because you can't put how it really works in this PMP. Not necessarily anything nefarious, but states sometimes are very picky in how, what, when, where, and why the formatting and content of PMPs are submitted to be approved. How do you see an organization maximize the efficiency of utilizing a centralized PMP, and how do you have that correlate to actually how the business needs to be ran and not just by appeasing the state for the PMPs?
Yeah, great question, and we've been on other sides of the table on a deal here or there, Ryan, so we've run into that from different perspectives. But and in some cases it's mandatory you have to have that. If I have a client that's operating in New Jersey and Massachusetts and Florida, the state regs are different, right? They require absolutely different things. In Florida, they're going to care that you have an emergency management plan for hurricanes. In New Jersey, they care that you understand what to do in a winter storm and utility failure, which we're not talking about in Florida. So, you need to have state regs. They're going to want those state regs cited different ways in your policy, and so you can have your state-specific that actually are different. Accreditation should be consistent across all of them, but your master playbook talks about what you do day to day, right? How are you actually admitting a patient? Frankly, if you're doing substance use, everyone should be following ASAM guidelines. If you're doing mental health, everyone should be under LOCUS, which is going to be an interqual or something along those lines, and you're following those guidelines and your payer guidelines. Whether you're in a different state or not should not change your criteria for how a patient is admitted to your program, what your initial assessments look like. There may be some different wording. You may be calling it a diagnostic assessment in this state and a biopsychosocial in this state, but your overarching master playbook is actually the same. It's your brand, it's the quality of your treatment, and it's consistent across the board. And your master library should reflect that, even if there's state-specific nuance in some of your other libraries. What there shouldn't be, to your point, Ryan, is a whole separate operating playbook that is disaligned from your PNP library.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, the state-specific regulations for the PMPs are always interesting to me. I remember the team in New Jersey telling me, Ryan, we need to submit a nuclear, not nuclear detonation, but a nuclear disaster PMP to the state. I said, we're all going to be dead. What do you mean? What are we submitting? It's a nuclear explosion. What are we doing?
Duck and cover.
And if my plan for our company is the answer for anything, then there's a big issue. Like organizations that small should not be responsible for nuclear fallout emergency planning. It's a little above the pay grade, I believe. But the states will want what the states want. But we'll transition over to another segment we're going to call Culture as a Real Control System. And I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, what are the early cultural signs that you've learned to take seriously now because ignoring them will cost time, money, and trust?
Sorry, so I understand. So the early cultural signs.
Yeah, early cultural signs that you've learned to take seriously now because ignoring them will cost time, money, or trust.
I love this. So for me, it was really day one from a cultural standpoint where I made a decision out of the gate, having been in this space for some time now and been in healthcare for almost 3 decades, that we were going to create a people over profit model. And I think that is something that a lot of organizations come into saying this is what we're going to do, whether or not that's exactly what their intention is or not. But that's truly what my intention coming into Pathfinder was to really take our approach, build our processes and procedures, implement our leadership. And there's a really great author, Simon Sinek, who authored a book called Leaders Eat Last. That's a core book that we utilize for all of our leadership to really instill that cultural understanding that, leadership isn't supposed to be protected in the ivory tower and then everybody else is just sort of out there figuring it out and fighting for scraps. I think when you do that, it's a recipe for disaster. You're asking for failure. So for me, immediately out of the gate, our circle of safety extends to what would be, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but lowest person on the totem pole in terms of what they're doing, behavioral health technician. That's where our circle of safety ends. That culture directly reflects our compliance, our ability to stay compliant, our ability to communicate, our ability to grow, our ability to support. It offers hope. The goal is that it offers a certain level of comfort for communication. So when things aren't going well, staff is willing to speak up and they're willing to come forward. They don't have to worry about some kind of negative repercussion as a result of doing so. I think a lot of organizations, I've been part of them, have taken a different approach where it's like you have that inner circle that's really heavily guarded, and then everything else is just kind of happening as a result of whatever's happening. So I think it starts with just really it's acknowledging that this is from an organic standpoint for me, it's everybody, it's all people, and if we by taking that approach and we're not. And again, understanding profits are important. We got to keep the lights on, but I'm not going to sacrifice the safety of my staff or the safety of my clients for that profit, because the profit will come. So,
absolutely, thank you for that. Yeah, and same thing with any of my team that's worked with me. They know if there's an issue, by all means come. Let's talk about the issue, but come with solutions or ideas for how to resolve it, and that's so important. Really instilling that open communication and dialogue, as you mentioned, to have your team be able to not only address a problem, but then they're bought in with being able to offer a possible solution. You may go with it, you may not, but at least now they're, brought into the conversation. And that even applies down to a behavioral health tech. Hey, if you're seeing this, this is probably not something a CEO is going to be, racking his brain about for hours and hours a day, but if you have a simple solution, from being boots on the ground as a tech, bring it to us. Let's hear it. And so that idea of the cultural competency of being able to come and discuss with the leadership is so crucial. For Sariah, what cultural behaviors show up repeatedly in organizations? Because I know you deal with a lot of early stage and turnarounds as well, so I'm sure you've seen quite your fair share of it. But what cultural behaviors show up repeatedly in organizations when compliance problems don't surface until they're expensive? And how do those behaviors how were those behaviors unintentionally reinforced by leadership?
Yes, so there's one that comes to mind that we see over and over and over again, and I'll preface this with how compliance should be structured, and it's not really discretionary. The OIG, Health and Human Services, Healthcare Compliance Association all tell us compliance has to report to the top. They have to report to the CEO, the chairman of the board. They don't report anywhere else in that structure. They don't fall under finance. They don't fall under legal. And they don't fall under clinical. There's a reason for that. I mean, a big case that probably everyone in this room knows about that has nothing to do with healthcare at all is the Enron case. In that case, compliance reported to finance. And it turned into one of the biggest downfalls of a major American company. So, we have that structure, compliance reports to the top, but what happens in real life? We have a investor owner that decides they want to move into behavioral health. Maybe they've been in skilled nursing before, maybe they've been in real estate, but they want to take this adventure and dive deep into behavioral health, but they don't know the industry, right? So what's the obvious next step? You hire a strong clinical director, and that clinical director or executive director becomes the person that's running the facility. And then the next thing they do is they say, well, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't know this industry. I'm going to hire someone for compliance, and I'm going to put them reporting to the clinical director. So we have an instant conflict of interest, right? Now compliance, that's the one that's supposed to be making sure everything is right in the documentation, reports to the person that is over the documentation. So they're trying to correct the same person that they're auditing, right? It doesn't make sense. There's nowhere they can escalate from there. The clinical director on the same line is saying, listen, there's a therapist shortage everywhere. My clinicians are so overworked, they're tired, documentation is hard. I know compliance says they want you to annotate this record and fix this, but you're busy, we understand, don't worry about it. And then documentation drift happens, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and leadership is unintentionally saying, ignore compliance, just keep doing what you're doing until you end up with this massive gap from where you should be to where you need to be. Payer comes in, audits, pulls medical records, all of a sudden you're in an SIU audit, you're flagged, you're not getting payments anymore, and your money's getting recouped. So that's probably the biggest thing that we see, and it's so correctable by just setting the reporting lines of compliance correctly and making compliance report directly to leadership and making sure that that voice is heard and acknowledged. It's designed to protect your revenue, and it's designed to protect your patients.
Amazing. And so aside from the org chart position, what do leaders quietly do to teach staff to stay silent and instead of raising concerns that you see happen? So it could be unintentional, I'm assuming for the most part, but are there systems, structures, or other items outside of the org chart that kind of quietly get instilled in an organization that tend to scare or shy away people from raising those concerns?
The term I'd use for that is census affective disorder, and I didn't coin it, I heard it in another conference. But, when census, that growth, the heads in beds becomes the only metric that matters, that also silences everything else, right? There are a million KPIs that are quality driven that drive census. This isn't all about marketing and the front door of admissions, but sometimes leaders get so hyper fixated on that they feel anything that slows that down is a problem. So it doesn't have to be a compliance issue. It can be someone complaining about the quality of the food or the quality of the beds, but it's like, we don't care about that. All we care is what's happening on admissions. How fast are we admitting patients? What they really need to be focused on is the overall quality of the program. You can say you have an open door policy, you can say you have a culture of transparency, but if you don't have an anonymous reporting mechanism, you don't have a compliance hotline, or you're getting grievances and you're not doing anything about it, you're actually just virtue signaling. You've got to actually act upon these things that are coming in to continually to improve the quality on all facets of the organization. And ultimately, that fixes the census anyway. If you just focus on that front door and not anything behind it, you're never going to maintain, because your AMA rate and your quality ratings are going to drop so far that you're ultimately running from behind.
I completely agree. And the last thing I think anybody wants is not being able to have their employees come to them, and then in turn they go to a tip reporting hotline instead. And if your door's not open and you've pissed off the employees that much, that's a real possibility, and you see countless examples in Behavioral Health Business News articles about clinicians who have got whistleblower settlements and rewards for that exact thing. These issues are preventable. So shifting gears, we're going to go to leadership and accountability, where theory meets reality. We're going to start off with Michael. Michael, where do leaders draw the line between clinician autonomy and organizational risk? And where do you see that line quietly moving toward when it's moving toward growth? Because we know sometimes in growth periods, everyone gets stretched thin and lines may get blurred a little bit. How do we maintain that progress and compliance?
Well, so it really starts top down in the sense that for me, how I approached it was I intentionally and purposely picked a chief clinical officer that is heavily driven by compliance and really making sure that that she creates a really fair and equitable sort of working platform for all our clinicians. I think in anything that we do, you're going to have top performers that just sort of rise because they're gifted in one way or another, and then you're going to have on the flip side of that individuals that just choose to do the absolute bare minimum or even less than that. And then you've got most people that kind of fall in the middle. The danger of focusing on your top performers only is you run the risk of losing a whole lot of really great, talented people in the middle that just need development. They just need somebody to spend a little bit of time with them. I would probably venture to say most folks in this room, including myself, are sitting here because we had great mentors. We had people that worked with us that helped us to understand what guardrails, why these guardrails are important, why you should be doing this, and what are the possible ramifications for not doing these things. I would rather have 10 clinicians that understand that and that are willing to be good team players than one rock star clinician that everybody loves but is totally rogue. So I think it starts from leadership. I think it starts from culture. It starts from development. It starts, people want to feel appreciated. They want to see positive movement. So that's for me. Celebrating the one person that shines is never been really the way that I've chose to manage. It's good to recognize the person that shines, and then maybe there's a way to utilize that individual to help other people to grow, and then offer them growth in doing that. But that would be really the extent of where I would allow that person to sort of act without, totally autonomous.
I like that. And this is something that I have to admit has happened to me countless times. What's the decision leaders delay the longest because it's uncomfortable, not because it's unclear?
Sorry, the decision...
The decision that we delay because it's uncomfortable, not because the decision's unclear.
Boy, that's a good question. What would be uncomfortable conversations? Sorry, I'm trying to think of where a scenario like that we would come up with that.
Any short-term goal versus long-term goal prioritization going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think where my head is going with this is kind of seeing where some disjointed process and procedures kind of coming into play with sort of where we're at in our sort of current situation, with not having like clear end-to-end ownership over a task. So I think that sometimes when we have certain, it could be client care, the continuum of care for our client from admissions all the way through discharge, and then having multiple people owning different parts of that client's journey, and then not wanting to step on somebody's toes because you don't either feel like you can or they've invested a certain amount of time into it. But then so you just sort of let that continue. But what ends up happening is now you have this disjointed flow that can be disruptive to your overall operation. You may have things work really well through admissions, and then somebody else takes over for intakes, and then somebody else takes over for clinical. And each one of them may be doing the job really well, but there's not a seamless approach. So rather than, right now, sort of example for us, there are some systems that we have in place that applies to, that we need to designate that to the appropriate person for oversight. And then they can lean on other individuals that may have had a more active role at one point or another to help. But, we need that person to own that from start to finish.
Absolutely. I find it tends to be more of a tightrope balancing act as you grow and have to maintain those systems, because with growth obviously comes more responsibility, areas of focus, and then other things may start getting less attention and maybe a little Band-Aid, a little duct tape fixing things up along the way. And there always is that decision point of, hey, do we focus on this or that? And those painful decisions of whether something's working well or not well tend to be sometimes the hardest ones for me, because when you start with an initial plan, it takes a lot of ability to admit maybe, hey, this isn't the right plan, we got to back up, go in a different way, or hey, we're growing too fast, we let this fall through the cracks, whatever it may be. So I see a lot of struggle myself personally with that sometimes. For Becky, going over to the payer side of things, what leadership decisions most directly increase audit exposure or reimbursement risk, even when the clinical intent is good?
Yeah, I think it's something that one thing I see a lot of folks not do with their organizations is bring RCM into the conversation early enough as they're growing with new modalities and having those conversations with the clinical team and finding that balance in a note that supports the clinical compliance needs and a note that supports the billing compliance and the actual success of billing. I always joke that oftentimes RCM teams end up being the team that's under the stairs at finance or under the stairs on the operation team, where they're a little bit more siloed. And so I think bringing them in early to the conversations where we start talking about how are we going to code for this? How are we going to bill for this? What are the payer policies associated with this to be able to successfully allow us to bill? And so one of those pieces that we see a lot just comes to the clinical documentation, and in quite a few organizations fail to have a feedback loop from the RCM team. And so audits don't just magically appear out of left field. You often start seeing denials before you ever see communication of an audit. And is there any kind of feedback that's happening with the clinical team when we're seeing a high volume of documentation associated denials? Are we getting that information back so that those conversations that can be had, so that adjustments can be made before it becomes a bigger investigation?
I absolutely love it. Thank you so much. All right. The next segment is the future of guardrails. What will be forced upon the industry? And so I'm going to start off with Sariah. Sariah, what compliance expectation or control will become unavoidable in the next 5 years? Not because regulators demand it, but because industry growth will force it.
I think it'll be both. And it's AI governance. I think it's very clear. It's not 5 years out. It's in the next 12 months. AI is everywhere. There are more than 50 pending regulations floating through different states right now related to AI and healthcare. We're using AI all over the place. We're using third-party tools. We're using AI embedded within the electronic health record system. We use AI to write our emails now. It's literally everywhere. But if you start polling people that are actually provider organizations right now to ask if they have an AI governance committee, if they have policies and procedures related to how they use AI, they don't. One of the biggest risk factors we're starting to see right now is non-HIPAA compliant utilization of AI. And frankly, there's just a lack of awareness of it. Someone doesn't understand that PHI and ChatGPT is actually a breach, right? So we need to educate on these things, set the governance up, set the policies and procedures, and get ahead of it. The regulations are trending probably a little faster than the providers are right now, but the providers will need to get on board. Some way, somehow, there'll be standardization across all the state policies. But I expect that by the end of 2026, Joint Commission and CARF will have policies around appropriate use of AI in behavioral health facilities as well.
100%. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I was just having this conversation recently. I sit on the board of Rutgers University, the Center for Addiction Studies. It's a research institute going back since the 1920s, focusing on addiction care. And a lot of what they do is forming policy. And a couple years ago, a lot of it was, through federal funding, was a lot of it DEI initiatives in healthcare, things like that. And as of recently, switching to the AI governance, especially in behavioral health care, because we all see the horrible news articles coming out about different AI chatbots that will reinforce a person's belief that suicide is a good option, things horribly like that. And so I personally worked with the Institute on this, and I know there's a lot of progress on it. I know Dan Gemp here in the audience has been working with the government officials in DC as well about this topic. It kind of rings close to heart, and I agree 100%. when we see, and I could definitely admit I am one of these people, when I see an email come across and I read it and it has that long dash in it, I just chuckle to myself because we all know what that is. We all know how it was written. I've written my emails like that too. It is a huge factor. But AI keeps on increasing in this space. And a lot of the tools that we've seen work pretty well. Not perfect, but pretty well. And as with AI, the more data that gets fed into the system, the better, in theory, the better it gets trained. I did a dinner presentation with a group that took me out at another conference, and they were doing a really great idea for a dinner. They have an AI note writing software for behavioral health care, and they said, okay, everyone here at the dinner table, look in front of you. You have a notepad and a pen aside you. What we're going to do is we're going to do a mock group session. We have 5 people. We'll have as clients and 1 as the clinician. We want you to pretend to be the clinician. Observe this group and write a group note, either during it or after, about everything everybody said. And we'll compare the AI notes to your old notes at the end of it. I could not believe how much I could not write down quickly, remember all these things like that. And if you're a clinician, I would say 99% of the clinicians are not writing notes live in group. They will write it after a group is done. And so if you have a group of 15, 20 people, good luck remembering every specific detail about that group session. And as we know, those details can also increase your auth and UR services, and so they're very valuable. And so there's a tremendous amount of use in the AI space. But one thing, unfortunately, that they're doing the review, and they're reading the one, oh, Johnny said this. Johnny didn't say that. And so, they're kind of caution at the end is, hey, this is a recommendation, not a pure clinical note, and so it needs to be double checked. But eventually, it'll get better and better and better, where maybe you won't need to check. It'll be that accurate. But as Sariah said, there's a lot of movement happening in the AI space, a lot of good progress, but just need to have some guardrails like anything else. All right. And moving on, we have the next question going toward Becky. On the RCM and payer side, what leadership decisions most directly increase audit exposure or reimbursement risk even when the clinical intent is good? Oh, did I ask you? I'm sorry. That was the other one. How do payer behavior and reimbursement pressure accelerate those requirements before regulations formally change?
So I think it's something that AI is not, I'm going to lean on AI because I think it's important in the reimbursement side of things. AI is not new to the payers. Most folks, when they are talking about their claim denials, those claims that are denied, they never saw a human being. They went through what's called an auto adjudication system. So this is not new, the use of machine learning and models to be able to make decisions around claims and reimbursement. This is where we see things happen when you're working on a billing model that does not fit the traditional standard, where your claims get denied because they're the exception to the rule that exists. And now you got to go through the human process. So I think it's something that we've been seeing this consistently in terms of decisions around reimbursement and when it's made and when it's not made have preceded whatever has been happening from an AI governance perspective and the introduction of it and the much more popular adaptation of it. And I think it's something that's going to continue to grow. Funny enough, there was a story in the news about a payer whose investors are none too happy because utilization was too high and providers were using these AI tools and they're getting too good at billing. And one of the pieces that a lot of folks don't realize is that non-compliance is a reason for denial. And so they hope you're not compliant because then they don't have to pay. The utilization, that rate is so high, it's not impacting their margins and they're keeping their investors happy. And so I think something we're going to continue to see is that kind of insurance and payer adaptation of technology that's available to try to get ahead of the providers to be able to protect their own internal models.
Amazing, thank you. All right, everybody, we're approaching the end of the segment. I want to thank our speakers so much for coming out today. Michael, Sariah, and Becky, let's give them a round of applause if we can. Thank you all so much, and of course, after, if any of you want to speak to our great panelists and utilize their expertise or services, feel free to approach them, and we thank you all for this wonderful event.